The chandeliers above the hotel ballroom threw off a cold, glittering light, the kind that made everything feel sharper than it should. I remember the clink of silverware freezing midair, the low hum of conversations dying as my sister Emily tapped her glass and stood up at the podium. Dozens of faces turned toward her, the soft rustle of suits and dresses brushing against their chairs. The smell of roasted salmon and white wine still lingered in the air, but I could barely taste anything. My tongue felt like sand. Emily's voice rang out steady and bright, cutting through the room like polished steel. As of tonight, she announced MillerTech will be moving in a new direction, one that requires stronger, more visionary leadership. Her eyes locked onto mine, the corners of her mouth lifting with something that wasn't quite a smile. And that means stepping away from the outdated and the inadequate. My father watched her with beaming pride, his hands folded over the linen tablecloth. I felt every heartbeat, like a hammer against my ribs, as the room leaned in, waiting for the blow they could sense was coming. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 33 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that hard work would eventually earn love. I grew up in a modest 2-story house in Maplewood, Indiana, where the smell of solder and burnt circuits drifted from my dad's garage workshop all year long. Dad built our small tech repair shop with the kind of pride other men reserved for their kids' baseball trophies. He used to say that the hum of a motherboard was more reliable than people. As a child, I never understood how true that was. Emily, my older sister, always had a glow around her, like she walked in her own beam of light. Teachers praised her perfect grades. Neighbors bragged about her scholarships. Even her footsteps sounded confident, brisk taps across our hardwood floors, while mine felt like softer echoes behind her. At dinner, Dad leaned forward whenever she spoke, his brown eyes fixed on her like she was reciting scripture. When I chimed in, his attention drifted to his phone or the steam rising off his mashed potatoes. Mom noticed I think she'd nudge the breadbasket my way or give my hand a small squeeze under the table, but she never said a word. By the time Emily left for a prestigious business program on the East Coast, the house felt too quiet and too loud all at once. I'd come home from my community college classes, carrying the faint smell of cafeteria coffee and scratched-up textbooks, only to find Dad grumbling over failing repair jobs. That was when I started helping him. Not because he asked, but because I could see the sag in his shoulders and the frustration pressed tight in his jaw. I'd roll up my sleeves, the cool metal of the workbench under my palms, and together we'd coax life back into old machines. Sometimes, when a fix worked, Dad would let out a short, surprised laugh. Those tiny cracks of approval were like sunlight on a winter morning, brief, but enough to keep me going. Still, I knew I was the shadow daughter. Emily sent postcards from glass skyscrapers and internship programs across the country, her cursive looping neatly across glossy cityscapes. Dad pinned every one of them on the corkboard above his desk, the paper edges curling in the warm shop air. None of my achievements made that board. Not the coding competition I won. Not the inventory app I built for a class project. Not even the dean's list letter Mom tried to slip under his morning coffee mug. He glanced at it, nodded, and tucked it under a stack of invoices never to be seen again. The first real crack in our family dynamic came during Emily's senior year when she came home for Thanksgiving. I'd been working quietly on a simple software tool during my evenings, the kind that made small business inventory tracking less of a headache. I remember the scent of cinnamon rolls filling the kitchen while I showed Dad the prototype on my laptop. His eyes lit up the way they used to when I was little. This could actually be something Sarah, he said, tapping the trackpad with a kind of amazed reverence. The warmth of that moment settled deep in my chest. Emily walked in a moment later, shaking off the cold November air, her hair catching the soft glow of the ceiling lights. "What are you two looking at?" she asked, moving closer with the crisp smell of her perfume drifting between us. When Dad proudly showed her the app, she let out a light laugh, one of those airy, effortless sounds that made me feel like the floor dipped under my feet. "It's cute," she said, her tone sweet but hollow. "But Sarah, you know, real tech companies aim for bigger markets, right?" Dad didn't disagree. He didn't defend me. He just folded his arms and nodded slightly, like Emily's word was the final stamp of truth. That was the first time I felt the sharp sting of being dismissed in my own home. The first time I realized that no matter how hard I worked, Emily could sweep the ground out from under me with just a look, a tone, a single careless phrase. But I didn't know then that her quiet disdain was only the beginning. The true blow, the one that would change everything, was still years away, waiting for me in a glittering ballroom under a chandelier's cold light. The July sun was sinking low that evening, slanting orange light across the lawn as my father carried the cooler toward the picnic tables. I was 12, clutching a bowl of potato salad I'd helped my mom make, feeling the sticky sweetness of sunscreen drying on my arms. Emily had just arrived home from a summer leadership camp, her suitcase wheels clicking sharply on the driveway. Neighbors turned toward her, their voices brightening, their hands lifting in greeting. I hovered a few steps behind, shifting my weight on the warm grass. When Dad pulled her into a proud hug, his laughter echoing across the yard, he didn't notice me trying to hand him the bowl. It slipped from my fingers and hit the cement with a flat, wet thud, mayonnaise and potatoes splattering across my sandals. For a moment, everything went quiet except for Emily's soft giggle and the hum of cicadas rising from the trees. Dad glanced over, annoyance tightening his mouth. "Sarah," he said, exhaling through his nose as if I'd ruined the whole afternoon. "Try to be careful." Then he turned back to Emily without another word. I've replayed that moment more times than I can count, the smell of crushed onion and dust mingling in the air, the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. Years later, I understand more than I did then. Looking back now, that small scene was just the first thread in a long, quiet pattern that wove itself into the person I became. Even as a child, I learned where I stood in our house. Emily walked into any room with confidence, her footsteps light but firm on our old hardwood floors. I drifted behind her, like a shadow, careful not to draw too much attention, careful not to drop anything else. The sound of my dad's voice always changed when he spoke to her, warm, energized, almost hopeful. With me, the tone softened into something polite, distant, practical. He wasn't unkind, just elsewhere. On school mornings, I would sit at the kitchen table, the linoleum cool beneath my bare feet, the faint smell of my mom's coffee drifting through the air. Emily's honor certificates were taped neatly to the refrigerator like tiny golden flags. I remember watching her glide down the stairs in a crisp uniform, her hair tied back in a perfect ribbon. Dad always paused whatever he was doing to say she looked ready for the world. When I followed with my tangled ponytail and a backpack held together with safety pins, he would nod and remind me not to forget gym clothes. Mom tried in her own quiet way to even the scales. She tucked handwritten notes into my lunchbox, little lines like, "Proud of you," or "Keep going." She smoothed my hair when Dad wasn't looking, and once she taped my science fair ribbon to the fridge beside Emily's plaques. By the next morning, it had been moved to the side of the microwave, half hidden behind a stack of takeout menus. Nobody said anything, but we all felt it. Holidays were the hardest. On Christmas Eve, our living room glowed with the yellow warmth of old string lights, and the pine scent of the tree filled the house. Emily always got the biggest gift: new electronics, the latest gadgets, expensive jackets with brand logos shining under the lights. I got useful things: sweaters, school supplies, a desk lamp. Dad said they were practical things I needed. Emily's gifts were things she earned for being exceptional. One year when I was 17, I watched her unwrap a leather-bound planner imported from Italy. The edges gilded her initials embossed on the cover. Dad's smile stretched wide, glowing with admiration. I opened my own package, the paper crinkling under my fingertips, revealing a basic calculator and a set of pens. "For your classes," he said, patting my shoulder as he reached for the camera to take Emily's picture. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a small smile. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need those grand gestures. But the truth is, the quiet ache of being second place settled deep in me like a slow chill creeping in through the window frame. When I started college, community college felt like the only door open to me, the only path Dad nodded at with approval. Emily visited one weekend during her sophomore year, walking into the house with the crisp scent of city air clinging to her coat. She spread her textbooks on the dining table, thick volumes with heavy spines that smelled of ink and ambition. Dad asked her endless questions about her classes, about professors he'd never heard of but pretended to admire. I sat nearby with my worn laptop humming on the table, my code editor open to a project I was proud of. No one asked about it. Sometimes late at night, as I tapped away at the keyboard, the soft glow of the screen lighting my room, I wondered if maybe I was meant to be invisible. Maybe silence was safer. My worth didn't seem to reach beyond the quiet corners where I tried to make myself useful. There were moments, small ones fleeting and fragile, when I felt seen. Like the day Dad first praised my inventory software in our shop, or when a local bakery purchased their first license. The scent of warm dough hung in the air that morning, drifting in through the shop's open door, and for just a heartbeat, Dad looked at me with something real in his eyes. Something proud. I held onto that moment the way a person holds onto light in a dark room. But even then, Emily managed to dim it. She visited the shop a few days later, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete floor as she stepped inside. Dad rushed over to greet her, leaving me halfway through a sentence. She glanced at my laptop screen, her expression unreadable, and said the app was sweet. That word again. Sweet, soft, harmless. Her tone left no space for recognition. Dad didn't correct her. He didn't say it had already begun to bring in revenue. He didn't say it mattered. So I learned to stop volunteering information. I learned to nod and agree and stay out of the spotlight. If Emily was the sun bright and celebrated, then I would be the quiet moon that nobody noticed unless the power went out. When I graduated from college, I didn't walk the stage. My finals clashed with a business conference Emily was attending, and Dad needed help at the shop. I remember the stale smell of solder, the hum of the fluorescent lights above my head, and the soft vibration of a text from the school congratulating me. I didn't show Dad. I didn't want to watch his attention drift toward Emily again. I wiped my hands on a rag and kept working. That's how years slipped by, small choices, little silences, moments where I stepped aside so someone else could shine. I never asked myself why I did it. I knew the answer. If Dad didn't fight for me, then maybe I wasn't worth fighting for. If Emily could brush me off with a single word, maybe that was all I deserved. But the truth is, those wounds, those little cuts, don't stay small. They deepen, they fold into your bones, they shape your voice until it barely rises above a whisper. And for a long time, I didn't realize how much I'd bent myself to fit the space they left for me. It wasn't until much later, when something in the present began to shift something subtle, at first almost imperceptible, that I realized the past had been preparing me for a moment that would force everything into the open. A moment that would crack the truth wide enough for me to finally see it. The office was dark except for the thin bluish glow of my computer screen, its hum steady in the stillness. I clicked open a folder I had never seen before, tucked deep inside our shared server, the timestamp showing it had been created less than a week earlier. My breath caught when the first document-loaded board meeting minutes stamped with my father's signature, the ink crisp and recent. I scrolled my finger, trembling slightly against the mouse, the faint scent of burnt dust rising from the old desk lamp beside me. The words blurred, then sharpened, proposal to transition sole leadership to Emily Miller. My name appeared only once obsolete management approach. A soft creak echoed in the hallway outside a floorboard shifting under unseen footsteps, but I didn't turn. My eyes locked instead on a series of emails unfolding in a sudden sickening trail, Emily coordinating with Dad drafting scripts, even timing the announcement all without me. One message from Dad read, "She'll accept it. She always does." For a moment, all I could hear was the slow, pulsing thud of my own heartbeat. I didn't know it then, but that night was the hinge my life had been turning toward for years. At first, all I could do was stare at the screen, the blue light washing my hands in a strange, cold glow. The documents felt unreal, like props in a play I hadn't agreed to perform in. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me, a faint chemical smell rising from the cleaning spray the janitor must have used earlier. Every word on the screen carried a quiet violence. Every line cut deeper. The more I read, the clearer the betrayal became. It started months earlier, quiet conversations scheduled on days I worked from home, meetings held just before I arrived at the office or right after I stepped out for lunch. I found attachments labeled Phase 1 Messaging Strategy Transition Plan. The language was clinical detached. Emily had written most of it herself. In one draft, she described me as competent but unambitious, a phrase that felt like someone pressing a cold hand against the back of my neck. Dad didn't correct her. He didn't even soften the edges. He simply approved it. As I scrolled, the office seemed to tighten around me. The faint buzz of the ceiling lights, the hum of the AC kicking on the cool air, brushing against the back of my hand. All of it felt strange, foreign, as if I'd slipped into someone else's life. I clicked open another email thread, and the truth deepened. They had already reached out to a PR firm to shape the announcement. Emily wanted a moment that felt monumental. My removal was just part of the stagecraft. I found another file, an unsigned legal document outlining a reduction in my authority. The smell of the paper fresh out of the printer still lingered in the tiny office trash can. They had planned to hand it to me at the gala. Not afterward, during. A public dismantling. A humiliation delivered under chandeliers. A slow ache settled beneath my ribs, rising like heat from a stovetop. How long had this been happening? How many times had Emily and Dad shared looks? I misunderstood. How many decisions had been cut around me like I was an afterthought? I clicked into a folder labeled Historical, and suddenly everything sharpened. 3 years ago, when Dad needed quick capital during the expansion, I had bought a portion of his shares. He'd signed, quickly distracted, grateful. I remembered the day, the scent of fresh paint in the office, the warm steam of the coffee he handed me, the way he patted my shoulder and said we were building something good. I never realized he'd forgotten what exactly he'd signed. But I hadn't forgotten. I kept the records, I checked the paperwork, and as I stared at the digital copy glowing on my screen, the truth hit me with a quiet, seismic force. I owned the majority, not by accident, not through deception, through hard work, through negotiation, through every late night I spent building our products while Dad slept, and Emily posed for interviews. Yet they were planning to erase me. The betrayal didn't start with those board notes. It didn't even start with the gala. It threaded back through years of small slights, decisions made without me, assumptions formed long before I earned them. In every email Emily wrote, I heard echoes of past dinners, past holidays, past conversations where she spoke as if the world belonged to her. And Dad nodded in quiet agreement. I clicked on another file, a planned press release. Under Emily Miller's strategic direction, her vision has redefined. Her leadership marks a new era. My name wasn't there, not even as a footnote. A stillness settled around me, heavy and dense. The office felt colder. The leather of my chair pressed firm against my back, grounding me. Outside the window, the city lights flickered through the blinds, striping the room with thin slashes of gold. That was when it clicked. They had never seen me. Not truly. Not even when the company grew. Not when clients insisted on working directly with me. Not when journalists asked for interviews and I gently declined so our family image stayed intact. Every sacrifice I made had been invisible to them. I scrolled back to the first document, the board minutes, with my father's signature. His handwriting looked rushed, almost careless. That hurt more than anything. He hadn't even slowed down. As I leaned closer to the screen, I noticed something: dates, timelines, decisions arranged far earlier than I'd realized. Emily had been planning my removal for almost a year. Dad had been looped in 6 months ago. They'd been smiling in my face while carving out the ground beneath my feet. A strange calm washed over me, the kind that feels like stepping into a quiet, empty church late at night. The silence was thick, but it wasn't suffocating. It was clarifying. And in that still darkness, something shifted. All those years of stepping aside, of quiet endurance, of letting my work speak for me, it crystallized into a single sharp thought. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't a placeholder. I wasn't someone they could simply replace because they preferred a different spotlight. I reached for my notebook, the pages rough against my fingertips, and began to write dates, documents, ownership percentages, product licensing agreements, client loyalty clauses. It all connected into one undeniable truth: they couldn't take what wasn't theirs. The betrayal hurt. The shock cut deep. But beneath the ache, something steadier began to rise, an ember, small but stubborn, glowing warm and sure. By the time the office clock clicked past 2:00 a.m., the air felt different. The hum of the computer blended with the soft tap of my pen, the carpet cool under my bare feet. As I paced, thinking, piecing things together, every new realization tightened my resolve. Every file I opened lit another lamp in a hallway I'd been wandering in the dark for too long. I paused at the doorway, breathing in the faint scent of printer ink and the stale sweetness of the coffee I'd forgotten an hour earlier. Then I sat down again and opened a new email window. If they wanted to rewrite the story of our company, I would show them who the real author was. That night, with the blinds half open to the sleeping city and the blue glow washing over my desk, I made a decision, quiet, absolute, and final. The next time I walked into that office, I wouldn't be the one standing in anyone's shadow. The conference room fell silent the moment I slid the manila folder across the table, its edges whispering against the polished wood. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long stripes of light over the documents that spilled out: printouts, emails, signatures. Emily froze mid-step, the faint click of her heels echoing once before stopping altogether. My father's hand tightened around the mug he'd just lifted, the ceramic tapping against his wedding ring. A few team members lingered near the doorway, their murmured conversations breaking off as they sensed the shift in the air. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Before you say another word, I told them, you're both going to look at what you've done. The papers fluttered as I turned the first page, the rustle cutting through the stillness. Emily's face drained of color. Dad swallowed hard, his breath catching. Everyone else stood absolutely still, as if waiting for a verdict they didn't yet understand. And that's when everything began to unravel at once. But to understand why this moment carried the weight, it did. You have to know how I spent the night before, what I found, what I pieced together, and the choice I made when the sun came up. By the time dawn broke, I had already decided how the scene needed to unfold. The office was quiet in those early hours, the carpet still holding the coolness of the night, the hallway lights buzzing faintly overhead. I carried the folder in one hand, feeling the smooth cardboard grow warm against my palm. Inside were the documents I had uncovered: board, minutes drafts, deleted email threads recovered from our server backups. Evidence they didn't know I had. Evidence they never expected me to understand. I chose the main conference room for the confrontation not because of its size, but because its glass walls left nowhere to hide. Anyone walking by could see what was happening, though none of them knew yet that this morning would divide our company's history into a before and after. When Dad and Emily walked in with their usual morning confidence, the air shifted. Dad still smelled faintly of the aftershave he'd used my entire childhood crisp, minty familiar. Emily's perfume drifted in behind him, something floral and sharp. Their voices were bright, at first rehearsed, almost celebratory. But when I slid the folder toward them, that brightness faded. The room felt colder. I kept my hands steady as I opened the first set of documents. I didn't shout. I spoke the way someone speaks when they've stopped hoping for understanding and are simply telling the truth. "Let's start with these," I said, tapping the board minutes with a single finger. The paper made a soft thud under my touch. "Your closed-door meeting?" "The one I wasn't invited to. The one where you agreed to push me out." The realization of what I knew hit them in waves. First confusion, then alarm, then something closer to fear. Emily tried to recover, smoothing her blazer with a trembling hand. "Sarah, this isn't—" I raised another page. "Don't," I said. "You've already said enough." Her mouth closed, the faintest click of teeth meeting. I reached into the folder again and placed 3 more documents on the table, copies of emails I'd pulled from our backup logs. The glow from the overhead lights reflected off the glossy ink. "These weren't in your inbox," I said softly. "You deleted them. But you forgot, our system keeps nightly snapshots." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, catching the light. "This isn't how you think it looks," he murmured, but even he didn't sound convinced. And then came the moment I'd been bracing for. "Maybe you deleted the wrong thing," I said, sliding a new page forward. "Or maybe you didn't expect me to find it." Emily leaned closer, her breath catching. It was the forged signature. Her forged signature. On a licensing amendment, one that attempted to transfer my software rights from my independent company into hers. The room went dead still. Not quiet, still. Like the very air had stopped moving. Emily's lips parted, but no sound came out. Dad's hand gripped the arm of his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Someone outside the glass wall slowed their walk, their eyes narrowing as they took in our expressions. A soft murmur rippled through the hallway, the sound muted but unmistakable. I watched my sister's face as realization dawned on her. She had thought she was untouchable. She had thought she could nudge me aside gently, quietly, surgically. She never expected me to uncover this. I lifted the page between my fingers, the paper warm and thin. "This," I said, "is a federal offense." Emily's eyes widened so suddenly, she looked almost childlike, stripped of all her practiced confidence. "I didn't," she stammered. "That isn't, I never signed—" "You didn't," I said, "but you sent it. You emailed it to Dad. And the metadata shows you modified the file on your laptop." Dad's gaze snapped toward her, shock and disappointment crashing through his face in a single devastating wave. "You forged your sister's signature," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. Her silence answered for her. Through the glass wall, more employees had stopped walking. A few pressed closer, their reflections mixing with ours in the transparent surface. The whole building seemed to be holding its breath. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply set the paper down in front of her with the softness of someone closing a door. This wasn't just an attempt to remove me from the company, I said. You tried to take what you didn't build. You tried to claim ownership of the work that's kept this place alive. Emily's breath came in short, uneven bursts. Dad stared at the table like it was a battlefield he didn't recognize. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out the document that sealed everything, the one that detailed the licensing agreement Emily had tried to manipulate. The one that showed I still owned the intellectual property. The one that invalidated everything she had spent months planning. When I placed it on the table, the air shifted again. Not cold, not tense. Final. This, I said quietly, is why your plan ends here. Emily pushed back from the table too quickly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sharp screech that made everyone in the hallway jump. Her breathing hitched as she tried to find words, excuses, escape routes that no longer existed. Dad's voice broke the silence. "Sarah!" he said, his voice hoarse. "What? What happens now?" I stood smoothing the fabric of my blazer, the faint smell of fresh paper lingering on my fingertips. "Now," I said, "we signed the papers I brought. You both stepped down. Effective today." Dad closed his eyes, the weight of his choices settling onto his shoulders. Emily looked as if the ground had opened beneath her. "And if we don't?" she whispered, her voice thin. I gathered the documents back into the folder, the soft shuffle of paper echoing louder than her words. Then I walk out of here, and every client, every vendor, every investor who received my email this morning will follow. The hallway outside erupted in murmured whispers. A few faces pressed closer to the glass, stunned, wide-eyed, waiting. Emily sank slowly into her chair, her palms pressed flat against the table, as if steadying herself. Dad nodded once, small, defeated. "I'll sign," he said softly. Emily didn't look at me when she added, "I will too." When their signatures touched the page, the balance in the room shifted. The power dynamics that had ruled my life for decades tilted and finally settled where they always should have been. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply closed the folder, holding it against my chest, as the soft click of my heels echoed across the floor. As I reached the doorway, the room was still frozen in silence, every face carrying the weight of what they'd just witnessed. I stepped into the hallway, leaving behind the stunned quiet, the papers on the table, and the people who never expected me to stand at the center of the room. And for the first time in my life, I walked away standing tall. When I stepped out of the conference room, the hallway felt unnaturally quiet, as though the building itself was catching its breath. The glass walls behind me held the last echoes of raised voices, shifting chairs, and the slow crumble of my family's confidence. I walked forward anyway, each step a little steadier than the one before. The cool air of the corridor brushed against my face, soft and clean, a stark contrast to the heavy tension I'd left behind. My chest rose with a deeper breath than I'd taken in years. Something in me had settled. Something had finally clicked into place. The world hadn't changed, but the way I stood in it had. In the stillness of that moment, I understood that surviving the storm wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of everything I'd been too afraid to claim. The hours after the confrontation passed in a blur of signatures, quiet nods, and the scrape of chairs being pushed back as people made room for a new reality. By noon, my name alone sat at the top of our leadership documents. I held them in my hands, the paper still warm from the printer, and felt a surprising calm seep through me. Not triumph, not vindication. Just a quiet, steady assurance that I had taken back what had always been mine to protect. Over the next weeks, I reclaimed the company piece by piece. I walked through every department introducing myself not as the shadow they'd glimpsed in passing, but as the person who had built the ground they stood on. I listened to my teams, their worries, their ideas, their frustrations. I opened the blinds in my new office, letting the afternoon sun spill across the floor, its warmth sinking into my skin as if the room itself were welcoming me home. Sometimes I stayed late, the glow of my desk lamp casting a soft pool of light as I reorganized old files or cleared out drawers still holding remnants of Emily's presents cards, meeting notes, pens she never returned. I placed them gently into a box, feeling no anger, only closure. My boundaries with my family formed slowly like a tide drawing back after a long storm. Emily emailed twice with short-clipped sentences asking for clarification on her severance. I responded with professionalism and nothing more. Dad called once, his voice heavy with regret, the faint sound of the television murmuring in the background. I listened, the receiver warm against my ear, but something in me had shifted too deeply to be pulled back into old patterns. I told him I wished him well, that I hoped he'd find peace in retirement, and that the space between us needed to stay as it was for now. He didn't fight it. Maybe he finally understood that the daughter he'd overlooked had grown into someone he couldn't easily reach. Mom visited the office one quiet afternoon, bringing a small tin of oatmeal cookies the way she used to when I was young. The scent of cinnamon followed her into the room, familiar and grounding. She sat across from me, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes shining with both sadness and pride. She didn't ask me to forgive anyone. She didn't try to explain the past. She simply said, "I see you now, Sarah." Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her touch warm and steady. It was the kind of support I'd needed long before I ever knew to ask for it. In the months that followed, the company began to change in ways I'd only dreamed of when I was too tired to imagine anything different. Departments collaborated more easily. Developers stopped looking over their shoulders. Our clients, the ones who trusted me from the beginning, returned with a renewed commitment. I hired 2 new managers, kind, thoughtful people who valued teamwork more than titles. One of them, Mark, brought me coffee every Friday morning, the rich aroma filling my office as we talked about the week. Another, Diane, left small sticky notes of encouragement on my door, words like, "Progress is a kind of love, and remember to breathe." They weren't grand gestures, but they anchored me in a quiet, steady sense of belonging. At home, I started tending to the little things I had long ignored. I opened the windows more often, letting the cool Indiana breeze drift through my living room. I bought a pale blue paint for the walls, spending several evenings rolling it on in slow, careful strokes, while soft music played in the background. The smell of fresh paint mixed with hints of pine from the candles I lit, transforming the space into something warm and unmistakably mine. On weekends, I found myself drawn to the garden behind my house, its soil dark and damp under my fingertips. I planted a row of lavender along the fence, a color I've always loved, but never admitted to. Watching the seedlings take root felt like watching tiny pieces of myself rise again. When the company surpassed its next milestone, I didn't throw a party. Instead, I invited my closest team members to a small dinner at a local bistro. The lights were warm, the clatter of cutlery soft, and the smell of baked bread drifting around us like a welcome blanket. We toasted not to profits or public recognition, but to resilience, to hard work, to the quiet victories no one else sees. I looked around the table at these people who believed in me, not because of my last name, but because of the woman I had become. It was the closest thing to a family I had felt in years. One evening, near the end of summer, I found myself sitting on my back porch, the boards warm beneath my feet, as the sky shifted from gold to deep blue. Fireflies blinked softly in the yard, their glow fading in and out like tiny floating lanterns. I held a photograph I had once tucked away, a picture of our family in the early days of the repair shop, all four of us smiling beneath a handmade sign. The edges were worn, the colors fading. I traced my younger face with my thumb and felt a familiar ache, old but no longer sharp. I didn't want revenge anymore. I didn't want apologies or sudden understanding. What I wanted was peace, and for the first time, I felt close enough to touch it. As I sat there in the warm hush of the evening, I realized something simple and quiet, a truth I wish I'd learned sooner. Sometimes healing isn't about winning or proving anyone wrong. It's about finally stepping into the space that was yours all along. And once you do, once you choose your own worth without waiting for permission, the world around you shifts just enough to let you breathe again.